The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl to a locked animal shed where a secret drawer held proof of a buried betrayal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was late in the afternoon when Mark Razor Thompson, a member of the notorious Hells Angels, found himself on an isolated stretch of road in rural Oregon. The snow had started falling heavily, blanketing everything in a thick, white sheet. As the cold wind cut through his jacket, he felt an uneasy pull in his chest. Razor had been through enough rough roads in his life, but something about this particular evening felt different. He was on his way to a run, but the eerie silence surrounding him told him this wasn't just another ride. As his Harley-Davidson hummed beneath him, he spotted a figure in the distance, a small silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. It was a little girl, no older than 10, standing alone in the snow, shivering. She looked out of place, her clothes barely adequate for the freezing temperature. What was she doing out here, so far from any house or shelter? Razor slowed his bike to a stop, the rumbling engine quieting as he approached her. "Hey, kid, are you all right?" he called out, his voice gruff but gentle. The girl looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes, her small body trembling. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at him like she wasn't sure whether to trust him or run. "You lost?" Razor asked again, crouching down so he wouldn't appear as intimidating. The little girl finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to show you something important." Razor raised an eyebrow. What could a little girl possibly have to show him in a place like this? Still, there was something in her voice, something that made him feel like he couldn't just ride away. "Lead the way," he said, and with that, the girl turned and began walking her. Small footsteps crunching in the snow. Razor followed, not sure what to expect, but certain that this moment would change everything. After a few minutes, they arrived at a small, rundown barn that Razor hadn't noticed before. The structure was old, its wood darkened with age and neglect, and the door was locked with a heavy padlock. The girl approached the door and stopped. "This is it," she said, looking back at Razor. She seemed nervous now, as though she was unsure of what would happen next. Razor looked at her, then at the barn. Something didn't feel right. "What's inside?" he asked. The girl hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's where the truth is hidden." She knelt down in front of a small, hidden drawer beneath the doorframe, pushing aside some old straw. Her hands were shaking, but she managed to pull open the compartment. Inside was a small box, weathered and old. Razor leaned forward, intrigued. The girl handed him the box, and as he opened it, he found something that stopped him cold, a stack of old documents, and a small, tarnished key. Razor's heart raced. What the hell was this? And why had this little girl led him here? As he glanced at her, he saw a flash of something in her eyes, a kind of knowing that belied her age. This was no ordinary encounter. What he was holding in his hands was not just a key to a box, but the key to a long-buried secret. A secret that could unravel everything he thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and family. Razor knew in that moment that he had stepped into a deeper world, a world where his past and this girl's fate were intertwined in ways he could never have imagined. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the box, knowing that whatever came next, his life would never be the same. The box felt heavier in Razor's hands than it looked. He could see the girl was watching him closely, her eyes wide, filled with both hope and fear. Razor hesitated for a moment before he slowly opened the box. The musty smell of old paper filled the air as he unfolded the yellowed documents inside. He glanced at the first one, a faded letter that seemed to have been written decades ago. The handwriting was neat, but the ink was starting to fade, making the words hard to read. Razor's eyes scanned the page, and as he read, something gnawed at him. This wasn't just some old letter. It was a letter to a family member, someone Razor knew. His heart skipped a beat as the words became clear. It was a letter from his own father. The next document in the box was a picture, old and frayed at the edges. It showed a family standing in front of a house, but the faces were blurred, as though someone had tried to erase them. Razor's mind raced. This was too much to process. He had to take a step back. Who else knows about this? He asked the girl, his voice low and rough. She shook her head. Just you now, she said softly. Razor stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of everything. The letter, the photograph, the key. What did it all mean? Why was this hidden away in a shed? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming. Razor's head snapped up, and he saw a black SUV pull up outside the barn. His instincts kicked in. He shoved the box into his jacket and motioned for the girl to stay quiet. Stay here, he whispered, his voice commanding. Razor moved quickly, stepping outside to get a better look. The cold air hit him as he emerged into the snowy evening, his boots crunching in the snow. He crouched behind a stack of old crates, peering out from behind them. Two men climbed out of the SUV. Razor didn't recognize them, but the way they moved told him they weren't friendly. He could feel his pulse quicken. These men were here for the same reason he was, and they didn't seem like they were going to leave without a fight. One of the men knocked on the barn door. We know you're in there, the man called out. Razor's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. He wasn't sure who these guys were, but he wasn't about to let them get the upper hand. What do you want? Razor shouted back. The man paused before replying. We're here for something important. Hand it over, and we won't cause any trouble. Razor clenched his jaw, not trusting the man's words. Whatever they were looking for, it was clear. They weren't leaving without it. Razor considered his options. The girl was still inside, and he couldn't let these men hurt her. He had to act fast. Razor stepped out from behind the crates and walked toward the men, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. He needed to buy time. What's all this about? Razor asked, his voice cold and steady. You're in the wrong place, the man replied, eyeing Razor suspiciously. This is between us and the kid. Razor took a step closer. I don't know who you are, but you're not taking anything from here. If you want trouble, you'll get it. But if you want to walk away, you'll turn around and leave. The second man took a step forward, his hand resting on his gun. Razor felt his chest tighten. The situation was escalating quickly. But just as the tension reached its peak, the man with the gun stopped and looked over his shoulder. Razor followed his gaze and saw a shadow moving in the distance. It was another SUV, but this one was much larger. The headlights cut through the snow like a knife. The men looked at each other, their expressions filled with uncertainty. Get in the car, the first man said, his voice tense. They turned and quickly made their way back to the SUV, not looking back. Razor stood there for a moment, watching as the vehicles disappeared into the night. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His hand still rested on the knife at his belt. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over. Razor quickly made his way back into the barn. He found the girl still huddled in the corner, looking scared but unharmed. He couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He was about to tell her everything would be all right when he heard something else. A car. Another sound. Razor stepped outside again, but this time he didn't hide. The headlights of a different car cut through the darkness. It was a different group of men, their faces hidden behind dark glasses. They had a dangerous air about them, and Razor knew they weren't here for a friendly chat. He turned to the girl. We have to go, he said, grabbing her arm gently. They needed to move quickly, and Razor wasn't sure how long he could keep protecting her. Together, they sprinted through the snow, heading for the trees that would hide them from the approaching danger. Razor knew they couldn't run forever, but for now, he had to protect her. The secrets in that box were about to become much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The night air was thick with tension as Razor and the girl continued their desperate run through the snow-covered forest. The muffled crunch of their footsteps was the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the woods. Razor's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever or whoever was behind them. But the weight of the documents in his jacket pocket, the ones that had already started to unravel a part of his past he wasn't ready to confront, was a constant reminder of what they had just uncovered. The girl, barely more than a child, was keeping pace with him, though Razor could tell she was struggling to keep up. She was tough, but the cold, the shock, and the fear were taking their toll. Razor slowed his pace, turning to her. You all right? He asked, his voice low. She nodded, her face pale but determined. I'm okay, she whispered, but Razor could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He grabbed her arm gently. We can't stop. We need to keep moving. She didn't protest, but he could tell she was frightened, her small body trembling with every step. Razor's mind raced as they continued running. He had no idea who those men were, the ones who had shown up in the SUVs. He didn't know if they were after the box, or if it was something even deeper, something more dangerous. But he knew one thing for sure: they weren't going to stop. And neither could he. He glanced over his shoulder. The snow was falling heavier now, obscuring his view of the path behind them. Razor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then, he would hear the faintest noise, like the snap of a twig underfoot, but whenever he turned around, there was nothing there. The girl was still clinging to his side, and Razor kept his eyes ahead, focused on the path. The woods were dense, but Razor knew them well. He had spent enough time on the road to understand the terrain, to know how to move swiftly and quietly through the trees. They kept going, pushing deeper into the forest, the dim light of the moon barely making its way through the thick canopy overhead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they came to a clearing. Razor halted, looking around. There was no sign of pursuit yet, but he knew it wouldn't be long before those men caught up. He needed to think fast. He turned to the girl. "We have to get to shelter. There's an old cabin about a mile from here. If we can make it there, we'll be safe for the night." The girl nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Let's go," Razor said, his voice firm. He started moving again, guiding the girl through the snow toward the cabin. They walked in silence, their footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. As they neared the cabin, Razor felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, just a small, weather-beaten building tucked away in the trees, but it had been a safe haven for him in the past, a place to lay low when things got too complicated. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior. It was cold inside, but at least they would be out of the elements. Razor closed the door behind them and locked it. The girl moved to the small fireplace in the corner, rubbing her hands together to warm them. Razor stepped over to the table, setting the box down. He pulled out the documents and the old key, staring at them for a moment. There was no turning back now. Whatever was hidden in those papers would change everything. But just as Razor was about to open the envelope, a sudden noise from outside caught his attention. He froze. There it was again, something moving in the snow. Razor grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her close. "Stay quiet," he whispered. He made his way to the window, peering out into the darkness. His heart skipped a beat as he saw two figures moving through the trees. They were too far away to make out clearly, but Razor didn't need to see their faces to know they were the ones who had been chasing them. Razor's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. Not with the documents, not with the men closing in. He turned back to the girl. "We need to leave. Now," he said, his voice low but urgent. The girl's eyes widened with fear. "But," she started, but Razor cut her off. "There's no time to explain. Just trust me." He grabbed the box and stuffed it back into his jacket. "Come on." They ran out the back door, into the thick snow once again, Razor's heart pounding in his chest. The woods were silent around them, but Razor knew the danger wasn't far behind. They had to keep moving. But as they ran, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The betrayal buried in those documents was just the beginning. Whoever was after them wouldn't stop until they had everything, and Razor had no idea how far they were willing to go to get it. The cold was biting, sharp enough to freeze the breath in Razor's chest as he and the girl stumbled through the thick snow. Razor's boots left deep impressions in the snow as they moved quickly through the trees, the weight of the box heavy against his side. They couldn't stop. The men had already been too close to catching them once, and Razor knew they would come after them again. This time, they wouldn't be so easy to shake off. Razor's mind raced. He had no idea who these men were or why they were after the documents. But one thing was clear. They had to stay ahead of them, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The girl was slowing down now, her face pale and her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Razor's heart ached for her. She was just a child, caught up in something she didn't understand. He needed to protect her, keep her safe. But the weight of the documents, of the secret they carried, was something Razor couldn't ignore. He had to know what was inside them, what they meant. He glanced down at the girl, who was still following him, her small body struggling against the cold. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She nodded, but Razor could see the exhaustion in her eyes. They couldn't keep running forever. Razor looked ahead, his eyes scanning the darkening woods for any signs of movement. He could hear nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and their footsteps crunching in the snow. They had to find shelter, someplace where they could regroup and figure out what to do next. Razor spotted a small cabin in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was old, its wooden structure weathered by years of neglect, but it would have to do. Over there, Razor said, motioning toward the cabin. The girl looked up, her face hopeful, but Razor could see the fear still in her eyes. They moved quickly toward the cabin, Razor's hand resting on the knife at his belt, just in case. As they reached the door, Razor paused, listening for any sounds of pursuit. Nothing. He pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly as they stepped inside. The air was cold, but still, the silence oppressive. Razor closed the door behind them and locked it. They were safe for now. Razor turned to the girl. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to check outside." The girl nodded, her eyes wide, but Razor could see that she was still scared. He left her in the cabin, stepping back outside into the snow. The wind howled around him, the snow blinding him for a moment as he scanned the area. There was no sign of the men yet, but Razor didn't trust that they had given up so easily. He stayed outside for a few minutes, keeping watch, before finally retreating back into the cabin. The girl was sitting near the fireplace, her small hands wrapped around a cup of hot water that Razor had found in the cabin. She looked up as he entered, a small but grateful smile on her face. "Thanks," she said softly. Razor nodded, his mind still on the documents. "We're safe for now," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't truly safe. The men would be back. They wouldn't stop until they had what they were after. And Razor couldn't let them take it. "I need to know what's in that box," he said, almost to himself. He pulled the box from his jacket and set it down on the table. He glanced at the girl, who was still watching him. "You don't have to be here for this," Razor said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll handle it." The girl shook her head, her small hands tightening around the cup. "I want to help," she said quietly. Razor studied her for a moment, her words hanging in the air. There was a strength in her that Razor hadn't expected, something that made him want to protect her even more. But he couldn't let her be a part of this. He had to keep her safe. "I'll take care of it," he said again. He opened the box, carefully unfolding the documents inside. The first paper he pulled out was a faded letter, its ink smeared with time. Razor's fingers trembled slightly as he read the first few lines. It was a letter to his father. A letter that revealed a part of his family's history he had never known about. The girl leaned closer, curious. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Razor paused for a moment, looking at the girl. He didn't know how to explain it to her, how to tell her that this letter could change everything. "It's about my family," Razor said slowly. He folded the letter back up and placed it on the table. "But it's not just that. There's something else." He pulled out the next document, a photograph, its edges frayed and torn. It showed a man standing in front of a house, but the face was blurred, hidden by some sort of black mark. Razor's heart raced. He knew that face. It was his father. The man in the picture was the same one in the letter. The same man he had thought he knew. Razor felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just about protecting the girl anymore. This was about uncovering the truth about his family. The betrayal. The secrets. And whatever it was, Razor knew it had been buried for far too long. The room felt suffocating as Razor stared at the photograph, his heart pounding in his chest. The man in the picture was undeniably his father, but the black mark that blurred his face told a story of its own. The man who had raised him, who had taught him how to survive in the world of the Hells Angels, now seemed like a stranger. Razor's fingers trembled as he turned the photo over. There, scribbled in a hasty, unfamiliar handwriting, was a note. "The truth lies buried in the past. It's not what you think." Razor's mind raced. What was his father involved in? What had he hidden from him? As the girl sat quietly in the corner, her eyes still fixed on the documents, Razor tried to make sense of the puzzle in front of him. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could see the curiosity in her eyes. He wasn't sure if he should tell her everything, but something inside him told him she deserved to know. "This is about my family," he said quietly, his voice distant. "But it's more than that. There's a secret here, something my father kept from me." The girl tilted her head slightly, her expression one of concern. "What kind of secret?" she asked. Razor hesitated. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he tell her that the truth about his family was buried under layers of lies and betrayal? That the man he had trusted most in the world had been involved in something far darker than he could have imagined? Razor closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He needed to focus. He had to figure out what the next step was. The men who had been chasing them were still out there, and Razor knew they wouldn't stop until they had everything. I don't know yet, he finally said. But we can't stay here. We need to keep moving. They're going to come looking for us. The girl nodded, her face pale but resolute. Razor could see the strength in her, even though she was just a child. She had been through so much already, and yet she was still standing. Razor grabbed the box with the documents and stuffed it back into his jacket. We need to find a way out of here, he said, turning toward the door. As they stepped outside, Razor immediately felt the cold hit him like a wall. The snow was still falling heavily, and the wind cut through his jacket. The world was a blur of white, and Razor struggled to make out any shapes in the distance. He didn't know which way to go, but he knew they couldn't stay in the cabin for long. Razor motioned for the girl to follow him as he began walking through the snow. He tried to keep his pace steady, but the girl was struggling to keep up. Come on, Razor said, looking over his shoulder. We need to keep moving. The girl was breathing heavily now, and Razor could see that she was exhausted. She was doing her best to keep up, but the cold, the fear, and the weight of everything they had just uncovered were taking their toll. I'm fine, she said, though Razor could hear the strain in her voice. Just stay close, Razor said, his tone softer this time. We're almost there. He didn't know where there was, but it felt like the right thing to say. They pushed forward through the snow, their footsteps leaving a trail behind them. Razor kept his senses alert, scanning the woods for any signs of movement. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing, and Razor stopped. He didn't know why, but something told him they were being watched. He turned to the girl, his hand on her shoulder. Stay here, he whispered. Razor moved quietly toward the edge of the clearing, trying to get a better look at what was out there. He could hear faint voices, muffled by the wind. The men were close. Razor's heart skipped a beat. He had to think fast. He couldn't afford to get caught. We need to find shelter, now, he said, turning back to the girl. He pulled her to her feet and led her toward a thick cluster of trees nearby. As they moved deeper into the woods, Razor felt a growing sense of urgency. They couldn't stop. They couldn't rest. They were too close to being caught. The snow was falling harder now, the wind howling around them as they pushed forward. Razor could barely see ahead, but he kept moving, determined to get the girl to safety. And then, just as he thought they might be able to catch their breath, Razor heard it, a faint rustling in the trees behind them. His pulse quickened. He turned to the girl. Run, he shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her forward. They sprinted through the snow, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the wind. Razor could hear the men's voices growing louder, but they were too far behind. Razor kept his focus ahead, knowing that if they stopped, they wouldn't be able to outrun the danger. They ran until Razor's legs were burning with fatigue, until the cold felt like it was seeping into his bones. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. Razor's mind was a blur of thoughts about the documents, about the men chasing them, about the girl who had somehow become his responsibility. He didn't know how he had gotten to this point, but there was no turning back. They had to survive. They had to keep moving. The sound of their feet crunching through the thick snow was the only thing that filled Razor's ears as he and the girl continued running, their breath coming in labored gasps. Razor's heart raced, and though his legs ached, he couldn't afford to slow down. They had been running for what felt like hours, but Razor knew they couldn't stop. The men chasing them were relentless. He could hear their voices behind them, faint but growing louder with every passing minute. The girl, still clinging to his side, was struggling to keep up. Razor could see the exhaustion on her face, the pale skin drawn tight over her bones. She was doing her best, but Razor knew the cold and the fear were beginning to take their toll. He could feel his own body starting to tire, but he pushed through the pain. He had to protect her. We're almost there, Razor said, his voice breathless but steady. Just keep going. The girl nodded, though Razor could tell she was barely able to keep moving. She was so young, too young to be caught in the middle of all this. Razor's thoughts were a blur of fear and frustration. He didn't know who these men were or what they wanted, but they had made it clear they wouldn't stop until they got what they were after. And Razor knew they weren't just after the box. There was something bigger at play here, something that could destroy everything Razor had ever known. The trees around them started to thin out, and Razor's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of shelter. He could hear the sound of the wind howling through the branches above, and the cold was starting to bite into his skin. They needed to find shelter, and fast. Suddenly, he spotted a small cabin in the distance. It was old, the wood weathered and worn, but it was something. It was a place to hide, a place to rest, even if only for a little while. There, Razor shouted, pointing ahead. We're almost there. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with relief. She picked up her pace, though her steps were shaky. Razor kept moving, his gaze flickering back over his shoulder. The men were getting closer. Razor could feel the tension building in his chest. They couldn't outrun them forever. They had to make it to the cabin, and then figure out what to do next. As they neared the cabin, Razor heard the sound of footsteps behind them. The men were getting too close. They had to act quickly. Razor shoved open the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't wait for the girl. He motioned for her to follow him inside. The cabin was small and dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood. Razor quickly slammed the door behind them and locked it. The sound of the men's voices outside was muffled, but Razor could tell they were getting closer. He knew they wouldn't be far behind. The girl collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily. Razor took a moment to catch his breath, his back pressed against the door. He couldn't hear the men anymore, but he knew they weren't far. They would come looking for them. Razor looked at the girl, who was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. What are we going to do? She whispered. Razor didn't know how to answer her. He didn't have a plan. All he knew was that they had to survive. We'll figure it out, Razor said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He walked over to the window, peering through the dirty glass. The snow was still falling heavily, and the world outside was a blur of white. Razor couldn't see anyone approaching, but he knew it wouldn't be long before the men found them. He had to keep the girl safe. Razor's mind raced as he scanned the cabin. There was no way out. The only thing they had was the door and the small window. He could fight, but he didn't know how long they could hold out. The girl stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the door. I'm scared, she said softly. Razor's heart clenched. He didn't want her to be scared. He didn't want any of this to happen. But there was nothing he could do to take away her fear. I know, Razor said, his voice gentle. He walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. But we're in this together. I won't let anything happen to you. The girl nodded, though Razor could see the doubt in her eyes. She was still just a child, and this was no place for her. But Razor wasn't going to leave her. He couldn't. He walked over to the fireplace, which was little more than a pile of charred wood and stone. There was no fire to keep them warm, but it was the only shelter they had. Razor sat down on the floor, his back against the wall. The girl joined him, sitting close to his side. The silence was deafening. They sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the men to arrive. Razor's mind kept drifting back to the documents, to the photo of his father, and to the letter that had started all of this. What had his father been involved in? What had he been hiding? Razor didn't know, but he was going to find out. The girl shifted beside him, pulling her knees up to her chest. Razor glanced at her, his heart aching for her. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't deserve any of this. And yet, here she was, caught in the middle of a mess that Razor wasn't sure he could fix. Razor stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin once more. He didn't know how long they could stay here. The men would eventually find them. And when they did, Razor would have to be ready. But he wasn't sure what that meant, or what he was supposed to do next. All he knew was that they couldn't stay here forever. And whatever was coming, Razor had to face it head on. He turned to the girl. We need to move again, he said, his voice low and firm. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Where? She whispered. Razor didn't know the answer. We'll figure it out, he said again. This time, though he hoped he could believe it. The wind howled outside the small cabin, its icy breath forcing its way through the cracks in the walls. Razor stood by the window, watching the snow swirl in the night air, his mind racing. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The girl was sitting quietly in the corner, still wrapped in the heavy coat Razor had given her. Her eyes were wide, her small hands clutching the edges of the coat, but Razor could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been through so much already, and yet, she still had the courage to keep going. Razor couldn't help but admire her strength. She was just a kid, but she had already seen more of the world's darkness than any child should ever have to. The thought of what they were running from, of the men chasing them, made Razor's stomach tighten. He had to protect her. He had to keep her safe. He couldn't fail her. Razor turned away from the window and walked over to the girl. "We need to move again," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Where do we go?" she whispered. Razor didn't know how to answer her. He didn't have a plan. They were running, but running wasn't enough. The men were closing in, and Razor didn't know how much longer they could keep escaping. He didn't know how much longer he could protect her. Razor clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. He needed a way out. He needed to figure out where they could go, where they could hide. The truth was, they had no place to run to. Razor had spent years on the road, always moving, always looking over his shoulder. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. He had someone else to protect, someone who depended on him. Razor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice rough. "But we'll figure it out." The girl nodded slowly, though Razor could see the doubt in her eyes. She was scared, and Razor couldn't blame her. He was scared too. The past few days had been a whirlwind of confusion, of danger, of secrets unraveling faster than he could keep up. Razor's thoughts drifted back to the documents, the photographs, and the letter. The truth that had been buried for so long, hidden from him. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. That somehow, all of this, the men chasing them, the box with the documents, his father's past, was leading him towards something he wasn't ready to face. Razor looked at the girl again. She was still watching him, waiting for him to give her an answer. But Razor didn't have an answer. Not yet. "We need to find a way to get out of here," Razor said finally. "We can't stay in this cabin for much longer. The men will be looking for us." The girl nodded, but Razor could see the fear in her eyes. She was scared. Razor couldn't blame her. He was scared too. They had been running for so long, and Razor had no idea how much longer they could keep going. The world seemed like it was closing in on them, and Razor had no way out. "Come on," Razor said, extending a hand to the girl. "We're going to get through this. We have to." The girl hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. Together, they stepped out into the snow again. The cold hit them immediately, the biting wind cutting through Razor's jacket as they trudged through the thick snow. Razor kept his eyes on the path ahead, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The snow was still falling heavily, and Razor could barely see in front of him. He had to keep moving. They had no other choice. Razor glanced over at the girl, her small face pale in the dim light of the moon. She was shivering, but she was keeping up. Razor's heart ached for her. She didn't deserve any of this. But she was with him now, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. They walked for what felt like hours, the snowdrifts growing deeper with each step. Razor was starting to feel the strain in his legs, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. The wind was howling, the cold unbearable, but Razor pushed forward, his thoughts only on the girl and keeping her safe. After what felt like an eternity, Razor spotted a flicker of light in the distance. He stopped, squinting through the snow. It was a small house, barely visible through the snowstorm, but it was something. It was a chance. A place to rest, a place to regroup. Razor quickened his pace, pulling the girl along with him. They were close now. Razor's heart pounded in his chest as they neared the house. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. They would have to make do. Razor reached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He pushed the door open, the familiar warmth of a house greeting them as they stepped inside. The fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth immediately hitting Razor's frozen skin. He closed the door behind them, locking it quickly. Razor turned to the girl. "We'll stay here for now," he said, his voice firm. "We need to rest, but we can't let our guard down. We're not safe yet." The girl nodded, her eyes wide but filled with a new sense of hope. For the first time in days, Razor allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. They had made it this far. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had survived. And that, for now, was enough. The small house was a welcome relief from the freezing cold outside, But Razor didn't let himself relax completely. He could still hear the howling wind outside, and the gnawing feeling that they weren't safe here lingered in his chest. The girl, still huddled in her coat, sat by the fire, her face finally starting to regain some color. Razor paced slowly across the room, his mind churning with thoughts of what had happened, what was to come. The documents in his jacket pocket felt heavier now. The secrets they contained were beginning to feel like a weight he couldn't carry alone. As he walked past the girl, she looked up at him. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Razor stopped, his heart catching in his throat. He hadn't realized how much the stress of the situation had been affecting him. He wasn't okay, but he couldn't let her see that. He forced a small smile and nodded. "I'm fine. We're safe here, for now." But the doubt in his voice betrayed him. The girl seemed to notice, her eyes searching his face, but she didn't push. She just nodded and returned her gaze to the fire. Razor stood there for a moment longer, then turned to the table where he had left the box. He couldn't avoid it anymore. He had to look at the documents. What had his father been hiding? What was this all about? He sat down heavily in the chair, pulling the box closer. As he opened it, the faint smell of aged paper filled the room. He took out the letter first, the one from his father. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, yet foreign in its tone. Razor read the words slowly, absorbing the meaning. It was a letter explaining something Razor had never known, something his father had never told him. The letter spoke of betrayal, of a debt that had been paid in blood. Razor's heart raced as he continued reading. His father had been involved in something far darker than Razor had ever imagined. The Hell's Angels were just the surface. His father had been tied to criminal enterprises long before Razor had even known the truth. The letter mentioned names, people Razor had never heard of, but who were clearly important. The more he read, the more he realized that his father's past wasn't just a collection of mistakes. It was a network of secrets, one that Razor had unknowingly stepped into. He ran his fingers over the paper, trying to digest everything. But there was so much he didn't understand. And then he saw it. A name. One that made Razor's blood run cold. It was his own. His father had written about him. And not in a way that Razor would have expected. His father had known this day would come. He had known that Razor would find out the truth. Razor read the final lines of the letter, and his heart sank. "I'm sorry, son," the letter said. "I never wanted you to be a part of this. But it's too late now. You've been marked." Razor's hand dropped the letter onto the table. He sat back in his chair, the weight of the words sinking in. He had been marked. But by who? And why? He didn't know, but he had a sinking feeling it had something to do with the people chasing them. As Razor processed the letter, the girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice small, filled with a curiosity Razor didn't know how to address. He stared at the letter for a moment before answering. "It's about my father," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's about everything he kept from me. About why we're being chased." The girl was silent for a moment, her small form curled by the fire. "What does it mean for us?" she asked softly. Razor looked at her, his eyes tired. "It means we have to keep running," he said, his voice firming with a new resolve. "It means we have to find out what my father was involved in and why. And it means we're not safe. Not yet." The girl nodded slowly, understanding more than Razor had expected. They both knew that their time in this cabin was running out. Razor stood up from the table and walked to the window. He could see nothing but snow and trees, but that didn't comfort him. It only reminded him of how isolated they were, how alone they were in this fight. Razor turned back to the girl. "We'll have to leave soon," he said, his tone serious. "We can't stay here forever. We'll figure out what to do next when we get there." The girl didn't question him. She just nodded, her face set with determination. Razor felt a surge of gratitude for her strength, but it only made him more determined to keep her safe. Razor grabbed the box with the documents and stuffed it back into his jacket. He couldn't keep carrying the weight of the past, but he had no choice. The past was what had brought them here. The past was what they were running from. Razor stepped toward the door, his hand on the handle. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. The girl stood up and walked toward him. Together, they stepped into the cold night, the door shutting behind them with a soft thud. The wind greeted them, howling through the trees, but Razor knew that the worst was yet to come. They had no idea what lay ahead, but Razor had a sense that everything was about to change. They were no longer just running from the men who were after them. They were running toward the truth, toward the answers that Razor had been searching for his whole life. The snow continued to fall heavily, covering the forest floor in a blanket of white. Razor and the girl moved silently through the trees, their breath visible in the freezing air. The weight of the box filled with secrets pressed heavily on Razor's chest. The events of the last few days had sent him spiraling into a world of danger and uncertainty. They had been running from unknown threats, chased by men whose intentions were unclear but undeniably dangerous. Razor's mind kept drifting back to his father's letter, the words echoing in his mind. He had been marked. He had been marked for something his father had done long before Razor had even known the truth. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at him. His father, the man who had raised him and taught him everything, had been involved in a dark world that Razor could never have imagined. But now that the truth was out, Razor had no choice but to confront it. He had to face whatever his father had been hiding. He had to find the answers. The girl, walking beside him, glanced up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. Razor knew she was scared, but she was trying to stay strong. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They weren't just running from the men who had been chasing them. They were running toward something. Something Razor couldn't quite name. He had to protect her. He had to protect her from whatever was coming, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Razor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something moving in the distance. He stopped, listening carefully. The crunch of boots in the snow. They weren't alone. Razor motioned for the girl to stay quiet as he crouched down behind a large tree, peering through the branches. The shadows in the distance were growing longer, and Razor could make out the silhouettes of men moving through the woods. They were too far to see clearly, but Razor's heart rate quickened. He recognized the way they moved. They were the same men who had been chasing them. Razor's grip on the knife at his side tightened. He couldn't outrun them this time. They were too close. He looked over at the girl, whose eyes were wide with fear. She knew something was wrong, but Razor couldn't bring himself to say the words. He couldn't let her know just how dangerous this was. Razor pulled the girl closer, trying to keep her hidden behind the tree. He didn't know what the men wanted, but he had a feeling it had to do with the box he was carrying. They had to know it contained something valuable. Razor's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He had no weapons, no way to fight them off. The men were too many, too well armed. Razor's only option was to keep moving. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't risk being caught. He looked around, trying to find a way out. There was a narrow path leading through the trees to the left. It was their best shot at escaping unnoticed. "We have to move," Razor whispered to the girl. She nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also with trust. She knew Razor would protect her, no matter what. They slipped away from the tree and made their way down the narrow path, moving as quietly as they could. Razor kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The crunch of footsteps behind them grew louder. The men were following. Razor's pulse quickened, and he pushed the girl to move faster. They couldn't outrun them for long. They had to find somewhere safe. The path opened into a small clearing, and Razor froze. Ahead of them, a figure appeared, blocking their way. Razor's heart skipped a beat. The man stood tall, his face hidden in the shadows, but Razor could see the glint of a weapon in his hand. The figure stepped forward. "You're not going anywhere," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Razor's hand instinctively went to his knife, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The man was too close. Razor took a step back, trying to protect the girl behind him. "Stay behind me," Razor whispered. He didn't know if he could take this guy on. He had no choice but to try. "You're making a mistake," Razor said, his voice steady. "Let us go? You don't know what you're dealing with." The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You're a problem that needs to be dealt with." Razor's heart raced. This was it. There was no way out now. The man took another step forward, and Razor could see the tension in his muscles. He was ready to strike. Razor wasn't sure if he could survive this. He didn't have time to think. He had to act. In a split second, Razor lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light. But before he could make contact, the man moved with surprising speed, sidestepping the attack. Razor's knife cut through the air, missing its target. The man countered with a punch to Razor's stomach, sending him stumbling backward. Razor gasped for air, pain shooting through his body. But he didn't have time to recover. The man was already on him, grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off the ground. Razor struggled, trying to break free, but the man's grip was like iron. "This ends now," the man growled. Razor's vision blurred, and he felt the pressure building in his chest. He couldn't breathe, but just as he thought he might lose consciousness, he heard a noise. A sound. A crack. The man's grip loosened for a split second. Razor took his chance. With all his strength, he kicked the man in the knee, sending him stumbling backward. Razor dropped to the ground, gasping for air, and immediately pulled the girl into his arms, shielding her from the man. He couldn't let this happen. Not now. The man glared at him, his face contorted in fury. Razor was ready for the next move, but just as he prepared to fight, another figure appeared behind the man. A shout rang out. "Get down!" Razor's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the voice. It was another voice Razor had never expected to hear again. He didn't have time to think. The figure lunged at the man, knocking him to the ground in a blur of motion. Razor's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He turned to the girl, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over. But maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The man who had knocked the first attacker to the ground stood over him, his eyes filled with cold determination. Razor's heart was still racing, and his mind was barely catching up with what had just happened. The man who had appeared out of nowhere had saved him and the girl. Razor stood there for a moment, still catching his breath, his eyes darting between the fallen attackers and the mysterious figure who had just intervened. The girl, trembling and wide-eyed, clung to Razor's side, her face pale with shock. She had seen violence before, but this was something else entirely. Razor pulled her closer, trying to offer a sense of safety, but the tension in the air was thick, and Razor knew they weren't out of danger yet. The figure who had saved them straightened up, his movements fluid and controlled. He was a man of average height, dressed in dark, weathered clothes that blended with the night. But Razor could see the confidence in his stance, the way he held himself like someone who was used to being in control. "You all right?" the man asked, his voice low and steady, his eyes shifting from Razor to the girl. Razor didn't immediately answer. He was still processing everything. The attack, the sudden rescue, the strange man. Who was he? What was his connection to all of this? "We're fine," Razor said after a moment, though his voice was still rough. The man nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the surroundings. "Not for long," he said, more to himself than to Razor. Razor understood what he meant. They weren't safe. Not yet. The men who had been chasing them were still out there, and Razor had no illusion that this fight was over. "We need to go," the man said, his voice urgent now. "I know a place. We can lay low there for a while." Razor hesitated. He didn't trust this man, not yet. But they didn't have a lot of options. The men who had chased them were bound to regroup, and Razor knew they couldn't outrun them forever. "Who are you?" Razor asked, his tone hard. The man didn't flinch. "Someone who's been watching you for a while," he replied, his voice unbothered. Razor's mind raced, his suspicions rising. "And why would you do that?" he asked, stepping closer, keeping a protective arm around the girl. The man's gaze flickered to the girl, his expression softening for a brief moment before returning to Razor. "I have my reasons," he said simply. "But right now, it doesn't matter. We need to move." Razor didn't like it, but he couldn't argue with the man's logic. They had to go. "Lead the way," Razor said, reluctantly. The man nodded and turned, motioning for them to follow. They moved quickly through the woods, the snow now coming down in heavy, almost blinding sheets. Razor kept his senses alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The girl was still walking. Close beside him, her eyes darting around nervously, but Razor could tell she was exhausted. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but he couldn't. He didn't know that himself. They walked for what felt like hours, though Razor knew it was probably less than that. The man led them through dense woods, his steps sure and quick, while Razor followed with the girl close behind. The cold was unbearable, but Razor didn't dare stop. He knew that if they did, they would be sitting ducks. The sound of their footsteps was the only thing that filled the silence, and Razor kept his focus ahead, hoping the man knew where he was going. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods, and Razor saw a dim light ahead. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that they were close to safety. The man led them to a small cabin, tucked away in the trees, almost hidden from view. Razor could see that the place was old, the wood darkened by age and the elements. but it looked sturdy enough to offer them some shelter. The man unlocked the door and stepped inside, motioning for Razor and the girl to follow. Razor hesitated for a moment, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. He didn't know this man, and he wasn't about to take any chances. But as they stepped inside the cabin, Razor felt the warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth, the heat a welcome relief from the cold outside. The girl immediately moved to the fire, her shivering body starting to warm up as she held her hands close to the flames. Razor stayed by the door, his eyes never leaving the man who had saved them. "Thanks," Razor said finally, his voice soft but sincere. The man nodded. "It's not over," he said, his tone serious. "You've got people after you, and they won't stop. But for now, you're safe." Razor didn't trust him completely, but he knew the man was right. This wasn't over. They were far from safe. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Razor allowed himself to relax, just for a moment. He turned to the girl, who was now sitting by the fire, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Rest," Razor said softly. "We've got a long way to go." The girl nodded, her head drooping as she fought to stay awake. Razor looked at her for a moment, a deep sense of protectiveness filling him. She was the only thing that mattered now. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. But deep down, Razor knew the truth. They were being hunted, and the road ahead would only get darker. The man was right. This was just the beginning. The warmth of the fire was a temporary comfort, but Razor couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The cabin, though a welcome shelter from the cold, felt like a ticking clock. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind through the trees, reminded him that danger was still out there, closing in. The girl was finally resting, her exhaustion catching up with her. Her eyes were closed, but her shallow breaths told Razor that she hadn't fallen into a peaceful sleep. He sat near the door, eyes scanning the room, every movement calculated, as though preparing for an attack at any moment. The man who had helped them had gone quiet after the initial exchange, sitting across from Razor, eyes flickering between the fire and the window, as if he, too, was waiting for something. Razor couldn't read him entirely, but he felt like there was more to this stranger than he was letting on. "You said they won't stop," Razor spoke up, breaking the silence. The man's eyes shifted to him, and for a moment, Razor saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or something darker. "They won't," the man replied simply, his voice steady. "But they don't know the whole story yet. They're after the box, but what's inside is worth more than any of them realize." Razor nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if he trusted this man, but the truth was, they had no choice but to rely on him, at least for now. The box he carried, the box with the documents from his father, held answers, but also questions Razor wasn't sure he was ready to face. "And you?" Razor asked, leaning forward slightly. "What do you want with it? You've been following us for a while, so this is more than just a random act of helping out." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze returning to the fire. "I've got my reasons," he said at last, "but helping you is the least I can do. The rest, you'll figure out soon enough." Razor didn't push. He knew there was more to the story, but for now, he had to focus on the immediate problem, survival. The man had made it clear that Razor's past was catching up with him, and whoever was after him wasn't going to stop until they had everything. The girl, still curled up on the floor, seemed like a ghost in the room. Razor's heart clenched every time he looked at her. She was caught up in this mess, through no fault of her own. She deserved a life free from this chaos, but Razor knew that wasn't possible anymore. He had promised to protect her, and now more than ever, that promise weighed heavily on him. Razor's mind turned back to the letter. The words his father had written still burned in his mind, especially the part where he was marked. But marked for what? For some debt his father had left behind? Or was it something worse? The deeper Razor dug into his family's past, the more he realized just how little he knew about the man who had raised him. Razor's fingers brushed the edge of the box, but he didn't open it. Not yet. There was still too much uncertainty. They needed a plan. Razor stood, the old floor creaking beneath him, and moved over to the small table where the box sat. "We need to get moving," Razor muttered to himself. He had no idea where they were going, but staying here wasn't an option. He looked over at the man. "We can't stay here. They'll find us soon." The man's eyes flickered to the girl before nodding. "You're right. We'll leave at first light, but we need to figure out where to go next." I've got a place in mind, but it's not safe for long. Razor's chest tightened. They were in the middle of nowhere, and Razor didn't even know if they could make it to wherever the man had in mind. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only one they had. He glanced at the girl again, her face still pale, her expression drained of any hope she might have had. She hadn't signed up for any of this, but Razor couldn't help but admire her resilience. In some ways, she was stronger than him. She had survived longer than anyone could have expected, and Razor was determined to keep it that way. As the night wore on, Razor sat by the fire, barely able to rest. His mind raced with thoughts of what came next. The men who were chasing them would not stop. Razor knew that the moment they were out in the open, they would be at risk again. But there was no turning back now. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, to uncover the truth, and to survive. The hours dragged on, but as the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls, Razor knew it was time. He stood and walked over to the girl, gently shaking her awake. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and Razor offered her a quiet smile. "Time to go," he said softly. She nodded, her tired eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. Razor grabbed the box, tucking it under his coat as he moved toward the door. The man was already by the window, peering out into the snow. Razor felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, but he knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to move. Razor opened the door, the cold air hitting him like a slap. The snow was still falling, but Razor could see their tracks from the night before, leading back into the woods. They weren't alone out here. Razor felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. They needed to move, and they needed to move fast. The door creaked closed behind them, and the cold hit Razor like a wave. The snow had turned into a relentless storm, the wind biting into his skin as he shielded the girl from the worst of it. His eyes scanned the forest around them, every shadow a potential threat. They had left the cabin in the dead of night, as silently as possible, but Razor knew it was only a matter of time before someone realized they were gone. He had no illusions about how long they could stay ahead of the men chasing them. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. The man who had helped them was ahead, moving swiftly through the snow, his movements almost ghost-like in the blizzard. Razor's eyes followed him, but his mind kept returning to the box he carried, his father's secrets. The girl, still shivering beside him, looked up at Razor. "Where are we going?" Her voice was small, but there was a strength behind it, a resilience that Razor didn't expect from someone so young. "We're heading to a place that's safer," Razor replied, though even he wasn't sure what that meant. They had to keep moving, that was all he knew. Razor's heart was heavy as he thought about the letter his father had written. The truth was starting to unravel, and Razor didn't know if he was ready to face it. But he couldn't ignore it. The men behind them were looking for something that Razor's father had hidden, and whatever it was important enough to send Razor on the run. The silence of the snow-covered forest was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps, the wind howling above them like a distant animal. Razor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was an instinct that had kept him alive in the past, but now, it felt like paranoia. He pushed it aside. The man leading them stopped suddenly, his silhouette barely visible through the storm. Razor caught up with him, pulling the girl close. The man looked back at them, his eyes sharp despite the darkness. "We're close," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Razor nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "How far?" he asked. "Not far," the man replied, his eyes scanning the woods around them. "But we're not safe yet. Keep moving." They pressed on, the forest now feeling more oppressive than ever. Razor's mind wandered again, to the letter, to his father's betrayal, and to the girl who was with him now. She was too young to be caught up in all this, yet here she was, fighting to survive just as much as he was. Razor glanced at her again, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she struggled to keep up. He knew he couldn't keep her in the middle of this for much longer. The road ahead was uncertain, and he didn't want her to lose what little innocence she had left. But she was tough. Razor could see it in her, in the way she moved despite the pain, despite the fear. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air became colder, and Razor could hear the sound of distant voices, muffled by the storm. He stopped, holding up a hand to signal the others. The man ahead of him turned, his eyes narrowed, listening. Razor strained to hear, but the wind carried the sounds away. It was hard to tell whether it was the men pursuing them or just the wind itself. "We need to get to shelter," the man said again, his voice tense. Razor felt the girl tugging on his sleeve. He turned to look at her, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "I think they're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Razor's heart skipped a beat. "Stay close," he said, gripping her hand firmly. The man in front of them began moving again, faster this time. Razor followed, pulling the girl along as they cut through the dense underbrush, heading toward the shelter the man had promised. The trees grew thicker, the wind howling louder, and Razor's breath came in ragged bursts. They had to be getting close. But something wasn't right. Razor could feel it in his gut. They weren't alone anymore. They had company. Razor stopped, motioning for the others to do the same. The girl looked up at him, confused, but Razor's eyes were fixed ahead. There, in the distance, he saw shadows moving. More than one, more than two. The men had caught up. Razor's mind raced. They were too close. There was no way they could outrun them now. "Go," Razor said urgently to the man in front of him. The man turned to him, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Get to the shelter," Razor ordered. "I'll hold them off." The man didn't argue, nodding before turning to lead the girl toward the shelter. Razor watched them go, his heart pounding. He had no illusions about what was coming. He couldn't fight off the entire group, but he couldn't just let them get away. Razor turned to face the men who were now closing in on him. They weren't far. He could see them clearly now, their figures dark against the falling snow. Razor's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side. He had to do something. He couldn't let them catch the girl. Razor took a deep breath and stepped forward, making himself visible. He wanted to get their attention, to draw them away from the others. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. The men stopped, noticing him immediately. "You should have kept running," one of them called, a mocking grin on his face. Razor didn't reply. Instead, he shifted his stance, ready to defend himself. He knew the girl was close behind him, and as long as she was safe, he would do whatever it took to buy them time. The men approached, their boots crunching in the snow, but Razor didn't back down. He planted his feet, ready to face whatever came next. The wind howled around him, biting at his exposed skin, but it only sharpened his focus. The girl was safe for now, hidden behind the trees, and that's all that mattered. He wasn't going to let these men get to her. Razor's fingers tightened around the knife at his side as he faced down the approaching group. They weren't more than 20 feet away now, their figures casting long shadows against the falling snow. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man, stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "You're a fool," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You should have stayed hidden. It would have been easier for you." Razor didn't respond. He wasn't here for words. He was here to protect. "Get out of the way, and we'll make it quick," the leader continued, his voice low, almost a growl. Razor's jaw clenched. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of surrendering. He stood his ground, eyeing the leader's men behind him. Razor's heart raced, but he remained calm. He had been in tight spots before, but this time was different. He wasn't alone. His thoughts flashed to the girl hiding in the trees, and for a moment, he was filled with a new sense of purpose. He would protect her, no matter what. The man's smug smile faded as he realized Razor wasn't going to move. "Fine," the leader sneered. "Your loss." He motioned for his men to step forward, and they began to circle Razor. Razor's eyes darted around, taking in their movements. He couldn't take them all on. He knew that. But he also knew he had to keep them occupied long enough to give the girl a chance to escape. Without warning, one of the men lunged at Razor, swinging a heavy fist toward his face. Razor sidestepped just in time, the fist missing him by inches. He countered quickly, his elbow driving into the man's ribs. The man grunted in pain, stumbling back. Razor didn't hesitate. He moved fast, striking again with a swift kick that sent the man crashing to the snow. But Razor wasn't done. He had to take them down, one by one, and fast. The leader roared in anger and charged at Razor. Razor braced himself, his heart hammering in his chest. The leader swung wildly, but Razor ducked low, avoiding the punch that would have knocked him out cold. Razor's hand shot out, grabbing the leader's arm and twisting it, forcing him to the ground. The leader snarled, but Razor had the upper hand now. His chest heaved as he stood over the man, but Razor's mind was focused on the bigger picture. He wasn't here to kill. He was here to survive. The other men, seeing their leader down, hesitated. Razor didn't wait for them to regroup. He charged at the nearest one, knocking him off balance and sending him tumbling to the ground. Another man lunged at him, but Razor caught him by the arm and threw him into the snow, making quick work of him. The fight was brutal, but Razor's experience and raw determination won out. The last man standing was the one who had been watching from the back of the group. Razor's breath was coming in heavy gasps, but he didn't let up. The man pulled out a gun, aiming it at Razor's chest. Razor's heart stopped. Time seemed to slow as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. But before the shot could be fired, there was a sudden movement in the trees. A flash of movement, and then a shot rang out. The man's hand jerked, and the gun flew from his grip, landing in the snow. Razor turned just in time to see the man collapse, his eyes wide with shock. Standing in the distance, barely visible through the trees, was the figure who had saved them before. Razor didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, grabbing the girl and pulling her from her hiding spot. They had to leave now. They couldn't stay here any longer. The girl didn't argue. She had been watching the scene unfold, her wide eyes filled with both fear and awe. "We're safe now," Razor whispered, but he didn't believe it. They had escaped this time, but there were still too many questions. The man who had intervened stepped forward, his face cold and unreadable. "You're lucky," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But don't get too comfortable. This isn't over." Razor nodded. "I know," he said, his voice tight. "Where do we go now?" The man glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the woods. "Follow me. We'll talk once we're safe." Razor didn't hesitate. He took the girl's hand, and together, they followed the mysterious figure into the woods. As they moved, Razor's thoughts were a whirlwind. He didn't know who the man was, but he knew they couldn't stay in the open. They needed to keep moving. "I'll keep you safe," Razor muttered to the girl, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. They had escaped for now, but the hunt was far from over. Razor's eyes stayed focused ahead, his thoughts racing with the knowledge that everything he had known was unraveling, and there was no turning back.